Great, okay. So we're now recording. So Assistant Professor Rochelle Cote. So broadly, Dr. Cote's program of research considers the variable experiences of Indigenous people, ethnic minorities, and immigrants as they engage with mainstream society, whether through experiences of migration, social cohesion, or participation in cultural, social, and economic venues. So motivated by an interest in mixed methods and cross-national research, Dr. Cody primarily work focuses on Indigenous entrepreneurship and participation in mainstream markets, located within research and theory on social boundaries and social networks. Her work explores walking in two worlds, and movement across the Indigenous and non-Indigenous boundary. So Dr. Cody has written and presented on many aspects of social support, networks and social capital, reciprocity, ethnic tolerance, and Indigenous entrepreneurship. So in a professional capacity, she's provided consulting expertise to Nokia, the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation, the Policy Research Initiative, Aboriginal Policing Directorate, the Office of the Federal Interlocutor on Métis and Non-Status Indians, and Southeast Queensland Indigenous Chamber of Commerce. So Dr. Cody's research interests include understanding the link between social cohesion and social networks, the use of social networks and cultural knowledge in Indigenous entrepreneurship, and the intersection of Indigenous social mobility and identity. So we're very privileged to have Dr. Cody here with us this evening. So I'd like to hand it over to her and thank her again for giving her time. Yeah, that's it for me. Thank you, Dr. Cody.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. I'm noticing a bit of a lag in the connection, so I hope it doesn't get too bad throughout the talk, but as Sarah was saying, the talk's going to be recorded, so hopefully any of the technological issues that happen with the talk won't be a part of the recording. All right, let's see. There we go. All right, so this is me. As Sarah was mentioning, I am a Canadian scholar and I'm currently based out of Memorial University in Newfoundland. And just for those of you who aren't here, which I feel is most of you, this is just a little photo of where Sarah and I currently are in St. John's, Newfoundland. And before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting today and thank them for the opportunity to not only present my thoughts on their territories, but also have the privilege of seeing all of your faces as well and having the opportunity to chat with all of you today. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders of these lands, both past and present and emerging. So before I get into this, and just to kind of preface what I'm going to do today, I'm kind of building this talk around a couple of different things, I guess. And so one is kind of a how-to guide on how to do international comparative research and use the work that I did over the course of, oh goodness, about seven years across 3 different country contexts. And also talk a little bit, I guess, and bring in some of the findings and some of the theoretical extensions that were possible because of the work that I did throughout the course of my PhD and then a couple of research fellowships after that before I landed here at Memorial University. And so I guess just so that we're all on the same page, I want to start talking a bit about what I consider international comparative research to be. And so when I think of international comparative work, I think of research where the variable of interest or the variable of change, I guess, is considered to be the country context. And so in every other respect of the research that's being done, things are the same. So the research questions are the same, as well as the way in which the study is being carried out and the kinds of hypotheses that you are asking throughout the research. And so what changes really is where the study is being done and whether or not changing that country context is producing similarities or differences in a particular outcome that you might be looking at. And so my journey with international comparative work started in Toronto, Ontario, with my PhD. And so the study overall, it took place in Canada, the United States, and Australia with the comparison of urban Indigenous entrepreneurs and their experiences engaging with large marketplaces. And so essentially what I wanted to know was how living in cities, being business owners, having to do business in large mainstream marketplaces was impacting their connections to community, to culture, and vice versa. So how these various connections to Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and cultures were impacting their ability to do business at the same time. And so initially, when I was finishing up my PhD, which is a place that some of you might currently be in, was done my interviews, was writing up the dissertation, and I was really looking at next steps. And so in Canada, the equivalent of the ARC is the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And they have something similar to an early career researcher fellowship, but it's in the form of a postdoctoral fellowship for Canadian students. And if you win this particular fellowship, you can basically write your proposal to go and do research anywhere you want. You just need to justify it in the proposal and have it evaluated. And so in the university that I was at, we are always encouraged to apply for these types of funding streams. And so that I ended up doing, and I ended up getting the fellowship. And the proposal that I wrote was to basically go and do a postdoc and replicate my research study in Phoenix, Arizona. But I was affiliated with the University of Arizona that was in Tucson. And then once that was done, I ended up doing a second fellowship that took me to Brisbane. And again, it was this idea of doing a second comparative study of the work that I had originally started in Toronto. So this is just a checklist that I kind of designed just to sort of give people an idea of things that they should think about attending to throughout the course of doing international comparative work. And so I just thought it would be a bit handy to kind of have it in a bit of a checklist, but I am going to go through all of these in a bit more detail. And so before you're thinking about doing this work, and I will say that a lot of these go hand in hand, right? In terms of choosing a research site, finding partners, getting funding, and all of these things. A lot of this stuff has to be kind of happening at the same time, and being able to take the opportunity and do this type of work. I will say right now, it's incredibly busy. You have a limited amount of time in order to be able to get this work done. So you need to be thinking about next steps well in advance of actually being able to go and do the work itself. So likely one of the most important aspects of doing international comparative work is choosing an appropriate comparative research site. And I find it's a good idea to ask yourself whether or not the proposed site makes sense as a comparison. I think, that's probably the best place to start when you're trying to decide whether or not this is something that you want to undertake. And so some of the things to kind of think about is whether or not a secondary research site has, let's say, similar demographic attributes to the initial one, whether or not there are similarities or differences in things like political, sociocultural, economic, or legal structures in a secondary site. And then what specifically are you looking for in a comparison site? And so you need to really give all of this some thought and then see what the options are out there in terms of being able to go and do work in another place. And the other thing that you need to be thinking about as well is you need to be asking yourself what the affiliated university and the academics and researchers are like in a particular place as well. To a particular institution, will working with individuals at that institution provide, let's say, contrasting perspectives or new ways of looking at things? And so ideally, if you're going to go to a different university, you want exposure to different perspectives and not necessarily working with people who will reinforce what you already know. And so you really want to think about what the benefit is for you to go there, both to you as a growing academic, but also for your research program. And ideally, you should choose a site that fulfills both benefits as a scholar and as a researcher. And sometimes what you might find is that the site will choose you. And so there might be a grant or a fellowship that's offered that will allow you to do research, but predetermine where you will have to go. And really the only thing with that is just make sure that that particular site still makes sense in terms of the research program that you're trying to develop. So in terms of the work that I did, as I said, I was, finishing up in Toronto, and it was really a decision of trying to figure out where to go to next. And so with the fellowship that I had, it sort of dovetailed nicely into going to the University of Arizona. There was a faculty member there by the name of Stephen Cornell who was doing really, really interesting, innovative, and engaging work. And it just so happened that Phoenix, Arizona has one of the most economically developed and most diverse Native American communities in the United States as well. And so, it just kind of happened that I had the best of both worlds in terms of going to University of Arizona and being able to use Phoenix as a comparative site for the work that I was wanting to do. And similarly, going to Brisbane started with an opportunity to apply for a University of Queensland postdoctoral fellowship. And this was to go and work with Mark Western at the Institute for Social Science Research. And again, it just so happened that Brisbane had an Indigenous population that was very similar in terms of demographic characteristics, and it matched well as a third site to compare and contrast with Phoenix and Toronto. So I was fortunate in a number of ways that going there as well as going to Phoenix was a natural fit and also really, really exciting comparison cities to work in. And so Phoenix and Brisbane were able to serve as important comparisons to potentially validate the Toronto findings from the PhD work that I had done. And so in terms of the similarities, all three cities had similar histories of colonization by the British. They were similar of urban Indigenous people, so around 3 to 4% of the population was self-identified as part of an Indigenous group. And all three cities also had diverse ethno-racial populations with a dominant white or Anglo-Celt majority. But while the similarities are good, there are also some important distinctions that were across these three centers as well. And so some of these important differences that I identified were the differences in the relationships that Indigenous peoples had to varied levels of governments in these three cities. Whether or not there was an existence of procurement policies for Indigenous entrepreneurs and business owners. The ethnic composition, while diverse, Phoenix does have some differences from Toronto and Brisbane in terms of having a much larger Hispanic population in that city because of its proximity to Mexico and that southern border. There were also some differences in terms of what the local Indigenous economy looks like, or having cities that were proximate to reserves or traditional owner lands, as we call them in Australia. And there was also some differences in terms of the existence and the strengths of Indigenous networks in and across the businesses. And so having these three sites really allowed me to look at whether or not Indigenous entrepreneurs' experiences of urban centers, whether or not they were different or similar because of the different types of country or city contexts that they were in. So likely behind trying to find a research site, likely the second most important thing, and some might even argue that this is likely the most important thing, is trying to access funding. You can't go internationally and go and engage in primary research internationally if you don't have money to be able to do that. And so what I did, I just kind of had a quick look, and there are a few resources out there in terms of finding money in Australia to be able to go and do international research. Specifically in Canada, there are specific schemes that you can look at for Australian scholars to come to Canada. There are also specific schemes if you're in Australia and you want to go to Europe as well. And then, of course, some of just the general ARC grants, which do allow for some movement in terms of being able to go and do research in other places as well. But the other important thing to kind of remember is, we do have these larger sort of granting bodies that have funds, but the other place to look is that sometimes faculty members are recruiting postdoctoral fellows to come and work on projects, or they are recruiting postdoctoral fellows or just research fellows who they want interesting people in their communities, and they have funding to be able to bring them over to be able to do their own kind of work. And as I was mentioning before, the reason why I got to go to Brisbane was because of the University of Queensland Postdoctoral Fellowship. And so that was, again, an opportunity to be fully funded to go and hang out in Brisbane for a few years and also do the research that I wanted to do and have that comparative site, which quite honestly probably wouldn't have been done if that pot of money wouldn't have been available. Of course that's not working. There we go. So the other kind of interesting thing about being able to do this work, and this is an aspect of doing international comparative work that is likely to extend past the actual research project. What international comparative research allows you to do is it allows you to go to other places and build research partnerships with other academics and engage in really, really cool conversations on specific research projects as well. And the way that I talk about building research partnerships, but also alliances that I like to call them, is that you need to treat this aspect of the research, of doing international comparative research, really as a part of your job as an upcoming academic and a researcher. And so as soon as you know that you've got the funding and you're going to be heading to a different part of the world to do work, you need to start immediately looking for colleagues and community partners, if that's the space that you're working in. And you need to start doing that immediately. And you need to be open to learning from others, but you also want to look for scholars who are potentially senior to you, who are doing really, really interesting, engaging work, and also emulate the qualities of a scholar that you aspire to be. And so if you kind of have a vision of the type of academic or researcher that you want to be, you want to try and seek out people that you can either work with or learn from who have those characteristics and those qualities, and who will really not only be there to have those really great kinds of engaging conversations, but who can teach you something about the practice of research and the practice of being an academic as well. And so one of the ways, I guess, to do that is you want to look for opportunities to network. And this can come in a number of different forms in terms of looking for international conferences or disciplinary conferences that have draws from individuals who are all over the world who like to come and engage in the conversation around sociology. You want to send emails, you want to book coffee dates, lunches even, if you can. You really want to use these travel opportunities to connect and meet with other people, it's likely going to be one of the only times you'll be able to do that. So you really want to take advantage of that aspect of being somewhere else if you can. Another really great thing to do is you want to offer, or you want to take up opportunities and invitations to guest lecture on your work, even if it's not fully formed, even if you're still thinking about a particular project that you have just completed. Take that opportunity to give a guest lecture, and you might be surprised at the way that comments and questions back from the people that you're talking to can potentially drive the way that you're thinking about your work. And another thing that you should also be thinking about doing is, talking, if you're still at the point where you're finishing your PhD, if you're already you're doing a postdoc and you still have a supervisor or a mentor, you want to look to your supervisor or some of your senior colleagues and maybe see if they can help to facilitate introductions. A number of professors have colleagues all over the world, and they might actually be able to put you in touch with people. I've always considered that to be a part of my job as a professor, to be very honest, is to ensure that people are getting introduced to other people that they need to know in order to do their jobs. And so ideally, you'll be able to find other colleagues and people in your respective departments and institutes that will be able to do the same kinds of things for you. The other thing that is kind of important in terms of being able to take opportunities for networking is to start publishing, whether that be at conferences in the form of a conference paper, whether that be journal articles, writing op-eds for the conversation or things like that, but getting your name out there. And so if people do Google you after you send them an email, they have something of yours to look at that they might potentially find interesting. And what I also recommend is really to have about a 3 to 4 sentence summary of your work that you can use in emails or as part of an introduction when you might be meeting people at a conference, for example. And that 3 to 4 sentence summary needs to be something that will get people excited about the prospect of you coming to their university, about the prospect of working with you, about the prospect of potentially going for coffee with you, and all of these other sorts of things. But it doesn't really need to be that much longer than that. You just want kind of a little bit of a tidbit to get people interested. And so in terms of what I did along the way, I gave guest lectures both at the University of Arizona and the University of Queensland multiple times, actually, and I was always happy to take advantage of opportunities to do this. I spent a good amount of time going for a cuppa, going for lunch with senior colleagues when there was an opportunity. And being in a position where you're a research fellow or a postdoctoral fellow, you're not a student and you're not a faculty member, which means that you kind of have the flexibility and the freedom to be able to network on both sides of the fence if you want, and get to know those up-and-coming colleagues of yours who are getting ready to go on the market and engage in solo research projects outside of their current home department, but also, make connections with those faculty members at your institute as well. In case that these are individuals that you will want to work with in the future, and potentially look to these people to go after grants with and work on other things. And so once that's all done, and once you've found the next research site, once you've got funding, once you have a research supervisor or your partners are set, there's the mundane details to worry about. Things like booking flights, if that's possible, looking for a work visa, if you don't have residency or citizenship. One thing to think about is that when you are going into this other country, do you want to apply for permanent residency? Is that even an option for you? But that's something that you might want to think about when you are heading over there. The longer you stay in the country, as your work visa is in process of expiring, you might not actually have the opportunity anymore to apply for permanent residency. And you may have decided that this is a place that you really love, but too bad, the opportunity is no longer there for you. So this is something that I really encourage people, that if you think this is something that you want, is to start that process right away as soon as you land. Things, like immunization, ensuring that you have health insurance set up, having a bank account in case you need to transfer money in and out of local currencies. Also, something to think about is how you plan to travel around through your research site. If you're staying in one community, or if you have plans, let's say, to travel around to multiple research sites, are you going to need to build in a budget for traveling, more airfare, or do you need a car? What's the public transportation like? So all of these details, again, you really want to start thinking about and have an idea about before you actually get there. And this might all sound a bit pedantic, but the one thing to remember about doing international comparative research is that you are on a limited timeline, right? And so if you're on a work visa, you are going to only be in that country for maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, depending on how long your visa is for. Maybe even shorter than that, you might only have 6 months. And so the more that you can actually have worked out and planned and have thought about and have organized before you get there, the easier it'll be to sort of hit the ground running and get your data collection done. Right. And so once you arrive, you're going to have limited time. You need to maximize your ability to gather data. And again, relationship building is important. And yes, this is still a thing that you need to be doing when you get there. And relationship building is really something that needs to continue throughout the course of your research internationally, and arguably even after you leave. One of the other things that you need to do as soon as you get there is that you need to locate key informants that can potentially assist in developing a list of possible respondents, giving you some ideas about events and activities that you can attend if you're doing primary research, ways that you can potentially contact people if you're looking just to do a survey, and having those kinds of conversations about what it means to be in a different country doing research and what works well for being in that particular context. You want to make time to connect with other academics, again, possible partners, potential colleagues, because they're the ones that are going to be your source for local information and also guidance on how to approach people, some of the language variations. There'll be people who can potentially translate conversations for you if you need that to happen. My time in Brisbane went beautifully. I speak English. People in Brisbane speak English. It was great up until I had to listen to a phone message. And typically when I had a message, I could not understand what people were saying. And so I had to get one of my colleagues to come and listen to my phone for me and actually give me an idea of what a particular individual was saying on occasion. And I think it was something just as simple as not having the benefit of the person in front of you moving their lips. But, again, it pays to have, colleagues that you can very, very timidly go to and ask them to listen to a voicemail for you so that you can find out what the heck the person was saying. The other important thing about doing international research is that you're likely going to be going to a place and being completely by yourself. And so developing good networks of colleagues is also have somewhat of a social life when you get there. You want to have people that you can go out and relax with and be social with. Doing to at least have some type of an outlet where, if you've had a very, very long day of interviewing and it's potentially been a really, really hard day of talking to people about, their experiences, it's good to be able to have somebody that you can go and have a cocktail with, or that you can just go and hang out with. So again, that's something that we don't necessarily think of when we're going and trying to develop colleagues and find people at a new institution that we're heading to. So when you're getting ready to introduce yourself, and again, this is for key informants, this is for potential colleagues, you want to give some thought to what makes you unique. You know, why would people want to talk to you? And yeah, this goes for potential colleagues. This goes for respondents as well. A number of times when I was in Phoenix and when I was in Brisbane, potential respondents would ask me, well, why should I talk to you? You know, what is it about the work that you're doing that would, you know, make it something that I would want to be interested in doing? And so you have to be ready to give them a response to that question. The other thing that you want to be looking at is in terms of getting an ethics proposal in. And so ideally, you've done this study once before, and you have an ethics proposal that you can basically submit after you've tweaked it a little bit to reflect what the new ethics review board, or the IRB, I can't remember what they're called in Australia, but, you know, once you've kind of had a look at what the new requirements are, you should be able to get this done. And you do need to make a point of checking into this. In my case, with each university that I was located at, they all had different processes for getting approval or consent with Indigenous communities. And so these additional requirements needed additional time and effort to ensure that appropriate protocols were being followed before clearing ethics. And so for the work that I was doing in Phoenix and Brisbane, clearing ethics actually took a bit longer than I had anticipated, but because I had started this early, it didn't actually compromise my ability to get the data collection done too much. And always, always, always ensure that you're keeping your timeline front of mind as you go forward. And so you need to be organized. I always say that booking people for interviews is a full-time job. There's also a need to ensure that you're taking good field notes. You want to ensure that you have enough information so that you can remember people and places 5 to 10 years later. You might not be able to go back, and the people that you spoke to might not be available to talk to you anymore either. So the field notes are really all that you're going to have going forward. And again, this is really going to be your only kick at the can, so you need to ensure that, you know, you're doing things properly. The one thing that I did to ensure that I was getting through the process a bit quicker and a bit easier is that I hired somebody to transcribe for me. And so if you can afford to do this, if you have a budget for it, if you have limited time to collect data, it's a worthwhile investment to keep you on track with your data collection. And so I had 2 years in the US and I had 3 years in Australia. And so my goal was ultimately to do 80 interviews at each research site. And in the end, I didn't get 80 interviews per site, but I did come away with about 220 interviews in total across Toronto, Phoenix, and Brisbane. And so in terms of the work that I wanted to do, it was good enough, and it's allowed me to kind of move forward in terms of the writing and the thinking that I've been doing. So in terms of wrapping up, first things first, you want to celebrate your accomplishment. And the one thing that you need to recognize is that this is indeed a milestone, and you absolutely must celebrate the fact that you have done this really, really incredible thing of going to another country, undertaking research in a likely unfamiliar context. And you all can figure out how it is that you feel the need to celebrate that milestone, but it's an important thing to do. And then you need to go away, and then you need to start trying to make sense of it all. And so you need to start writing up your initial thoughts on the comparative aspects of your work, noting some similarities, but also noting some differences between the research sites. So again, you can come back to this and start thinking about how these similarities and differences are, let's say, contributing to the types of outcomes that you're noticing. In terms of coding and cleaning your data, this should be happening along the way. And you want to ensure that you're setting up your data files in such a way that you can seamlessly import and merge them together. If you've got survey data that you're working with, and you know, something as simple as ensuring that the variable names are all the same across the data sets that you're doing is incredibly important, so that you can actually merge them together and get onto the business of analysis right away. And the other thing that you want to do is you want to start the initial documentation of themes that are emerging across your sites. And so do you see themes that are consistent? Are there differences that are emerging? Write down the thoughts about why either is the case and start even trying to detail hypotheses that you might want to test. And the next thing you want to do is, yes, you want to consider the process of relationship building with your new colleagues and find out where are you guys going to go from here. And so again, send an email, thank them for their help, thank them for their knowledge, thank them for their companionship. Go for coffee if you have an opportunity to do that. And start getting some ideas down on paper for plans about a new grant or a research project that you might want to do together. And so it might not be anything that you can do right away or that you can start on, but the important thing is that you're having the conversation now and you can gauge the relative interest for others to pursue a new idea, but also start talking about a timeline of this new research project that you potentially want to do and a timeline that will work for everybody that you potentially want to be involved in it. And you also want to give some thought in terms of how you want to extend what you're currently doing and ensure that it fits within your current areas of interest and specialization. So is there another international comparison to be done, or is it time for something new? And so you want to sit with the current data a little bit and you want to see where it goes from there. You also want to follow up with your respondents. And so did you promise them a report or a summary of your findings? You want to thank them for their time and their thoughts, provide them with a forwarding email address if they'd like to communicate anything else to you. And you also want to follow up with any supporting agencies, partners, university that you're at. There might be opportunities there to look at how your work can impact public policy if that's something that you're interested in. Or make even a broader contribution past academia. And again, if that's something that you're interested in doing and pursuing those avenues. You could also potentially provide some initial key findings that you think might be important to these agencies or important to governments if that fits. And again, if you find that there's interest being shown in your work, you should really take that advantage to be able to contribute to that space. And also just sort of, general being able to close off your research with the university that you're affiliated with, provide that final ethics report and close the file with the relevant IRB or ethics board. And again, wrapping up also includes getting ready to potentially move again and also look for the next opportunity. Whether it's a postdoc or faculty position, a research affiliate for a private consulting firm, government, NGO. You also need to be looking at winding down your physical presence if that's what you're intending on doing. And so looking at things like selling or moving furniture, booking flights, and all of that kind of stuff. But I mean, all of this to say that doing this international kind of work is incredibly busy. You have to keep on top of your timeline, keep on top of, getting the work done that you need to be doing. But beyond that, it's incredibly fulfilling and satisfying to do. And the colleagues that you meet, the people that you meet, even some of the people that you will interview and talk to as a part of your study, these will be people that you might actually, continue to see and continue to communicate with well after you have left a particular research site. And so it's really, really important to attend to these individuals and attend to these relationships beyond, just being in a particular country context at the time. So I guess, when we're thinking about how this type of work can strengthen research in, the areas that this particular group is interested in. And so, multiculturalism, ethnicity, and migration studies. I gave some thought to this. This was one of the questions that Sarah provided. And I guess when I think about this particular question, in terms of the way that this type of work can contribute to this area of the discipline, is it becomes clearest to me when I'm looking at, my own work and in terms of evaluating the impact of colonization on Indigenous peoples. And so in this particular case, as you know, just an example, if you're looking singularly at one country, it becomes really, really easy to talk about the impact of colonization on Indigenous people as a unique case. But when you start comparing the impacts and the outcomes globally, you begin to recognize the way that policies have become institutionalized, that assimilation and cultural extinction were mandated to strip Indigenous populations of their culture and their connections. You can also see how these policies set up contemporary situations of discrimination, you know, where we see overrepresentation in criminal justice systems, we see high rates of homelessness, and a host of engagement with various social problems, and poverty, and other such things. And so by comparing, you know, the impact of colonization internationally, you can see that these issues aren't just localized to, let's say, Canada or just to Australia. They're a product of the way that the British went into these other countries and colonized in a way that had enduring effects on Indigenous peoples, and that this was in fact very, very purposeful in the way that the British set things up. And so in that particular case, these outcomes are harder to dismiss when you're looking at similar things that are happening with Indigenous peoples in 3 different countries. And you can provide the context in terms of possible solutions, although, you know, when we're talking about this particular population, the solution is somewhat complex in terms of what needs to happen. But global comparisons also allow us as sociologists to look at what's working, what could be better even for new immigrants into countries. And so what policies seem to facilitate integration into host country networks, into labor markets, economic, social, and political systems in a particular country. And it really, really helps us strengthen our ability to argue for change or keeping things as they are if particular policies seem to be producing desired outcomes in one country context. You know, the potential to be able to argue for the implementation of policy in another country context just becomes that much stronger. All right. So Sarah, that's the rest of what I have is just kind of talking a little bit about the particular study that I did. But I'm looking at the time, and I've got about 8 minutes to 10. And so I know we're on a bit of a clock, and so I think I want to leave time for questions. I think that's sort of where we want to go. Is that true, or yeah?
Yeah, no, if you want to finish up, you still have some time. So if you'd like to discuss your particular project, that'd be great.
I can do that. How much time do you want me to go for you?
About 10 minutes, if that's all right.
I think I can do that. Let's see how it goes.
If it's okay if you go over, it's quite all right. It's quite all right.
Your face is right beside mine, so just go like this, and I will clam up. It'll all be good.
Sounds good. Thank you, Rochelle.
All right. So the work that I did, I thought sort of a practical way that I could kind of show you what the advantages of international comparative work are is to kind of give you a little bit of a taste of what's kind of coming out of the work that I did across the 3 sites. And so as I was kind of mentioning before, I was basically doing case studies of Indigenous entrepreneurs and looking at what Indigenous social mobility looks like and how social mobility with Indigenous peoples impacts their access to culture, their connections to Indigenous networks, but also how this impacts conceptions of Indigenous identity as well. And so there were a couple of different things that I was able to do with this work. And I guess what I was initially looking to do was be able to extend the theory and the research on social mobility, but also look to contribute to policy and public accounting around Indigenous entrepreneurship in terms of the way that governments and nonprofits, as well as specific entrepreneurs, were talking about the experiences of being an Indigenous entrepreneur at the same time. So this is just to kind of give you an idea of the breakdown of who I was able to talk to across these 3 different sites. And the one thing that you'll notice is that in terms of the distribution of gender and age and level of education and annual income, is that things were pretty similar across the three sites. The interesting thing, however, to note, and this is more important when it comes to talking about how we talk about Indigenous populations as being Indigenous people or an Indigenous population, in that they're an entirely unified and similar group of people across. But the one interesting thing to note is that in these three centers, if you look at nations represented, what that means is the level of diversity and complexity of Indigenous nations that exist in urban centers. And so, you know, we had anywhere from 27 to 48 different Indigenous nations represented in these cities. And what that means is that it isn't just a uniform, unified Indigenous population, is that we actually have diversity within Indigenous populations that is important to consider, because it's quite likely that what these different groups want and need is in some ways quite a bit different. And so we need to start attending to that sort of thing. So I think, as I said, I did in-depth interviews with about 220 entrepreneurs across these three sites. And I was fortunate, I guess, in that my response rate across each site was about 80 to 90%. So I got really, really good uptake on getting people to sit down and chat with me about their experiences of being Indigenous entrepreneurs. And the interviews ranged in length from about 1.5 to 4 hours, depending on who I was talking to at the time. And so this is just some of the indicators of social mobility just for Canada specifically. And so this is originally how I started out my study, by kind of looking at some of these things in terms of Indigenous entrepreneurs. And so when we look at these indicators of social mobility in Canada specifically, what we should ideally notice is that Indigenous people are becoming increasingly social mobile. And so over the past 20 years, we can see this general trend of Indigenous people who are becoming increasingly urban. We're seeing more individuals who are owning their own homes. We're seeing increases in overall levels of education, as well as the number of individuals who are getting post-secondary degrees. We are seeing an increase in the numbers of people that are earning income that is above the national median in Canada. And we're seeing more people that are becoming employed full-time, who are professionalizing and who are entrepreneurs as well. So this is great. You know, we can talk about this, about the Canadian context, and this is excellent. But this doesn't allow us really to generalize this trend much beyond thinking about the conditions in Canada that might be facilitating social mobility in this particular case. And yet we know that there are other countries with Indigenous populations that are similarly colonized by the British, similar policies of cultural extinction. And so this is what led me to basically wanting to look at social mobility and what was kind of happening in the US and Australia, to see if we could find similar trends in these countries as well. And so what I was able to do is basically look at census data across these three countries. And so all of a sudden, when we expand our analysis to look at more sites, we can see clearly that there's something going on consistently with Indigenous peoples in these three countries, and that it's more than just a single instance happening in Canada, or just in the US, or just in Australia. And so what we're seeing is that roughly 60 to 80% of Indigenous people are currently living in cities, depending on what country we're talking about. And again, when we look consistently across other indicators like home ownership, overall levels of education, earning income above the median, the number of entrepreneurs, the number of professionals, we can see quite clearly that these things are increasing across all three countries. And so this is where we kind of take a bit of a turn, and we start thinking about some of the theoretical engagement that we can do in terms of what we're seeing here. And so even though we have this trend of upward mobility within the realm of academic research, there is a focus on Indigenous peoples as damaged populations. And this is in fact what brought me to this area of research in the first place, and that it was about this disconnect between what I saw going on at that time in my home province of Saskatchewan, which is just a few over from where Sarah and I currently are. And the ways in which Indigenous people were being characterized and written about in academia, and as we'll see in a couple of minutes, in the media as well. And so at that time, what I was noticing in the province was that there was increasing economic development. There was this creation of urban reserves, and I can talk more about that if someone has questions around what that is. There were starting to be a lot of promotion of Indigenous professionals and politicians, tribal investment in communities, lots of involvement and engagement in sports, lots of talk around philanthropic work, identifying individuals living in cities. Things were happening in this province, but at the same time, and even into the present day, a significant amount of work is focusing on Indigenous people who live on reserves, even though we know that the majority live in cities. Articles that do write about Indigenous people in cities are theoretical pieces that see individuals as members of a larger population that are not only disconnected from Indigenous culture and traditions, but the broader networks back to community and country as well, and also assimilated into the mainstream networks and the culture of the cities that they live in. And so irrespective of the location of Indigenous people on reserve or the city, the focus in academic work is most often on problems in Indigenous communities and with their experiences around poverty, disease, addiction, violence, and homelessness. And so in other words, they're being portrayed and cast as a perpetual underclass. And we also see the perpetuation of the problematization of Indigenous people. There we go. And so when we're looking at newspaper articles across these three countries, it's a similar kind of a thing. And so the focus is predominantly on social problems and inequality around health, poverty, crime, residential schools, conditions on reserve, as well as in cities. And headlines most often focus on Indigenous people in crisis who are struggling, who are overrepresented, facing worse outcomes, as lacking, as having failed, or as actors in sensational headlines that prioritize ugly stereotypes of the untamed savage. So when we're looking at the message that's being perpetuated, it's always and consistently one of significant disadvantage. So when we look at the breadth of writing that's currently being done in the media and academia, it leaves the impression that being Indigenous is tied to living on country in adverse conditions and dependent on government funding. And it also suggests that individuals who are doing well are disconnected from Indigenous culture and community and assimilated into mainstream societies of the cities in which they live. And so what got me going is questioning whether or not this was in fact true, because again, looking around at the time, this wasn't what I was noticing. But sample size of one, you don't really know if this is the case until you can actually do the research and find out whether or not this is true. And so this was essentially what my work was about, was to try and find out whether or not entrepreneurs who are really representatives of this socially mobile or upwardly mobile middle class within Indigenous populations, whether or not they were in fact assimilating into mainstream populations and disconnecting, as theory suggests. Let's see. I'll skip over that. If you have questions about how I measured this, I can just go through this at a different point in time. So I just want to get to the good stuff. Yep, we're good? Okay, oh, 5 minutes, okay. So what I in fact found when I talked with entrepreneurs, and again, across the three sites, is that in fact, the connection to community and connection to culture were integral to definitions of what these entrepreneurs considered to be successful business practices, right? And so on average, we found that entrepreneurs were participating well in Indigenous activities, They were just as connected with friends and family and colleagues of Indigenous ancestry as they were to people of European ancestry as well. What we did find, however, that also seemed to be consistent across the three sites is that they weren't very well connected to new immigrant populations in these three countries. And so we can think about new immigrants from Asia, or from Africa or from the Middle East. These connections didn't seem to be quite as extensive as connections to people who were considered to be of European descent. And again, they were participating quite well in Indigenous cultural activities, but also what we would consider to be mainstream cultural activities as well. All right. Just trying to think about what else I want to tell you here. Right. So what we actually found, or what I found, is that when it comes to this disconnect that clearly seems to be happening, is that entrepreneurs were talking about this idea that this disconnect was occurring on two different fronts. And so in terms of perceptions that individuals had around what an Indigenous person is supposed to look like, as well as perceptions around Indigenous people and success. And again, if you think back to what academia is typically talking about, or what media is typically portraying, we see where these disconnects and these perceptions and these stereotypes are coming from, right? But what we need to ask are some of these deeper questions in terms of thinking about what is creating or crafting these perceptions that are continuing to be perpetuated. And so when you think across these three countries, we think about historical practices around colonization. And so in these three countries, it was always assumed when the British came to colonize that Indigenous people would assimilate. And so in other words, they would cease to exist as nations and distinct groups. And so in each case, there were laws that were put in place to facilitate this end goal. And in terms of the present day defining of Indigenous identity, of particular importance was to embed identity in a legal definition that was determined by federal governments and was also regulated by federal governments. And so in most cases, this was taking the decision away from Indigenous nations, or tying this notion of identity to blood quantum to then be regulated by the nations themselves. But having said that, implementing wholly colonial and settler state mechanisms to control who could call themselves Indigenous. And on top of that, we see this focus on rural-based populations. And so in Canada and the US, we see treaty agreements that outline funding and resource streams specifically to reserve-based populations, with a complete lack of focus on urban populations. We also see that in Canada and the US, we have Indigenous governing bodies who exclusively represent and advocate at the federal level for Indigenous people who live on reserves. We don't have a similar organization in Australia. But again, governments have a tendency to focus and want to deal exclusively with Aboriginal populations who live on country, for example, right? And so what the result of all of this is a view of Indigenous identity that is tied to living on country, being poor, dependent on government services, without the recognition of the role that colonization has played in perpetuating the stereotype. And so what the international comparative research allowed was really for a deep dive into Indigenous social mobility, but also the ability to theorize about why this disconnect happens between this idea about being socially mobile and about being Indigenous at the same time. And so it allowed for the opportunity to expand thinking about how to define social mobility more generally and contribute to the discipline and the literature in that way, but also recognize that Indigenous populations are in fact increasingly diverse and in many cases resilient and thriving in a number of different contexts. And this would not have been possible without the collection of data across these three very different international research sites, right? And so in terms of risks and challenges, well, I think, in terms of primary research and risk, I think we're currently living one of the risks of doing international comparative research, where you need to displace yourself. You know, in the space of a couple of weeks, the world context changed rapidly with the development of a pandemic and COVID-19. Countries shut down international travel, started denying visas. Universities responded with curtailing and shutting down completely active research programs. And so these are things that can happen, and we have to be prepared to adjust, put on pause, and hope that our granting agencies will be gentle with us in terms of allowing us to continue. In terms of some of the challenges, working within the time constraints of a visa or a funding scheme, where you might happen to be at the mercy of universities and respondents that you're dealing with. You might run out of time in terms of not being able to do everything that you wanted to do. But you know what? That's okay. You need to keep thinking about the data. You need to keep writing things up. You need to keep presenting your work and talking with colleagues about ideas, and the insights will come eventually. So I'll end it there. I think that's about all I have to say for now. It's kind of gone all over the place, but I'm happy to take questions if you guys have them. And I will get out of here.
Thank you very much. Hannah, is that you? Do you have your hand up for a question? Or is it clapping? It's clapping.
No, it's clapping. Thank you so much. It's such a fascinating session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I might, if you don't mind, indulge me, Rochelle, kick off with a question, if that's quite all right.
I think moderator purview, you get to ask a question.
I appreciate the last slide around the risks and challenges, obviously, of current situation and people traveling overseas. Too personally, as you know. My question actually relates to a bit around the media question with Indigenous populations in the media. And for our international audience, I'm not sure if it was in the news in Australia or not, the recent protests in British Columbia and Alberta by the Aboriginal groups here in Canada due to the development of the railway line and the oil that was going through. And I guess just the public response and media response to that. And I wasn't sure if you could comment a bit around the, from your perspective as an academic working in this space, what were some of the, I guess, negative, potential negative impacts of the media coverage during that time on people, and the positives as well in response to that issue. And you can probably explain it better than I did as well.
Well, I guess the main issue that we have here in Canada is that we have, and so Australia has states, Canada has provinces. And so we have a province, or actually a couple of provinces, who are very, very big into oil production as a primary source of income and economic activity. And they are landlocked provinces, which means that if they want to extract the oil and refine it, they don't have the capacity to refine the oil in the province. And so what needs to happen is that the oil needs to be shipped to the coast of British Columbia, and then it needs to get put in an oil tanker and either shipped across to China or take another avenue, which is a pipeline that basically goes south. Either case requires very, very long pipelines that go across not only provincial and state boundaries, but the way that the routes for these pipelines are being mapped is that as well. And the problem with this in Canada and the US is that tribes and First Nations in North America have treaty agreements that recognize these tribes as nations. And so, you know, you have these agreements where the land that you have a pipeline that a particular company wants to put through Indigenous lands with without actually trying to get permission from the nations who technically govern the land. And so, as Sarah was saying, there were protests around from Indigenous nations around the building of these pipelines to try and, I guess, stop the construction of these pipelines. And so the response to the demonstrations was twofold. You had people who were in support and you had people who were against. And the problem is that, you know, and it's a similar problem in Australia as well, in that we don't get enough good information about who Indigenous people are in these countries, what their histories are, and who they are as peoples. And the problem with that is that when you don't have access to, I guess, the information and the history where these First Nations and these tribes are actually recognized as independent nations, is that you don't understand what it means to have a foreign government want to build a pipeline through your land and not get your permission. It would be like New Zealand coming over and saying, we're going to build a pipeline through Australia because we just, you know, we need to do that. And obviously Australia would probably have some major problems, you know, with New Zealand trying to do this without trying to negotiate with Australia to do this properly. And so there were massive counter protests and counter demonstrations against what the First Nations were trying to do to try and basically shut them down. And yeah, I mean, you know, typical responses that you see based on a lack of understanding really of who Indigenous people are, right? Yeah. I could talk about racism. This talk is about international comparative work. we can have a conversation about racism another day.
Yeah, well, super diversity, racism, these are all really important issues. Obviously, the people in the Australian audience as well in this stream will have touched on, particularly when we talk about multiculturalism and where Aboriginal nations fit in with super diversity and multiculturalism conversation as well, is something that some people have mentioned as being of keen interest. Now we have time for one more question, if anyone else would like to raise anything, or if you'd like to follow up as well.
There's a question. Hi, thank you so much. Yeah. There's a question in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
From Hannah.
Okay, so Hannah asks, how do you begin recruiting Indigenous participants given that you are new in Phoenix and Brisbane?
Oh, yeah, so super fun. Really, when you're working with Indigenous communities, you need to be able to, you need to get referenced by someone. And so you know everything that I was saying in my talk in terms of finding those key informants, going to events, getting your name out there, participating in things, but just being open and willing to, you know, participate in Indigenous communities is really, really helpful. But at the end of the day, you know, you can only do so much with randomly calling up people and telling them that you're a researcher from another country. What needs to happen, and what I did most often, is at the end of an interview, I would ask somebody who they thought would be a good person to talk to. And then I would email those people and say, you know, I had a chance to chat with so-and-so. They said that you would be a really great person to chat with. I was hoping to, you know, be able to sit down with you and talk about your experiences, and 80 to 90% response rates. So that's just kind of, you know, how you have to do things. But the thing is that I wouldn't actually say that would be exclusively for working with Indigenous communities. I would actually do that exact same thing for working with, you know, other populations as well.
Thank you.
I think Richard had his hand up.
He did. Thank you.
Just get When you were talking about selecting locations for comparison, one of the things highlighted was the political environment. I can see that Australia and Canada, from my knowledge, have got, you know, good comparisons. They're variations on a British parliamentary structure. Obviously, America is completely different. For all intents and purposes, it's impossible to understand from afar. So how did that work out in terms of your research?
So I got the heck out of the US in 2012. So this was way before the current situation in which we all seem to find ourselves in with respect to the United States. And you're right, you know, Canada and Australia are based on the British parliamentary system, but in terms of the federal government's relationship to Native American tribes, it's still quite similar. And so that's more what I was interested in looking at in terms of the types of policies and things like that that were developed with respect to Indigenous peoples in these three countries. And so, you know, and the different types of agencies and things like that were being crafted at the federal level. And so in that way, looking at these three countries, and arguably, I would even say that New Zealand would fit within there as well. You know, New Zealand might be my sabbatical research, to be honest with you, because we could very, very easily compare across the four countries and look sort of a bit differently at the way, you know, that that Indigenous peoples are existing in these contexts, right?
No, that's interesting. I'm looking at issues around urban planning in terms of cultural perspectives, and just as thinking about, you know, countries might be relevant. And of course, very much to do with political basis. So certainly Canada, New Zealand are countries that I'm particularly interested in looking at. So anyway, it's been a very good session. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences.
Well, thanks for your question.
Well, thank you. If anyone has any burning quick comment they'd like to make before we clue up, they can make them now. Otherwise, we have a few closing remarks I'd like to make.
Well, feel free to email me if you prefer that forum. I am happy to chat off Zoom as well.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. So on that, actually, we'd like to, I guess, note that the session is recorded. It will be posted and shared through the TASA, the Australian Sociological Association's YouTube page. A link will be sent to all the attendees as well. And if anyone does have any questions, you know, happy to field them and then maybe kind of punt them off to you later if you're happy to answer any questions at a later date.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. That'd be great. Thank you very much for your time. At 10:30, you will promptly get something in your email inbox as a little thank you from us. Just you know, it's not spam, I promise, but just a thank you for the time that you took to come here today. And I'd also just really quickly like to share something on my screen if I can figure out how I can do it. I used to know. So we have a couple of events coming up here. Next Gen conversation about sessions happening. We have one in July. It's about migration, multiculturalism, and post-colonizing land. So it talks a bit about some of the issues that you've discussed here tonight. And in August, interdisciplinary research. And then moving into September. So some of the dates are to be determined, but we will share those for those who are interested at a later date. But again, I wanted to thank everyone for coming, and thank you, Rochelle. We have lots of people who've emailed because of the way this world is at the moment with everything online and multiple meetings. A lot of people have, navigating times and things, so they're really looking forward to having this recording. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening and morning.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great to see all your smiling faces.
Well, thank you. And on that note, thank you everyone for coming out. I hope you all have a really lovely day. And thank you, Rochelle. I hope you have a lovely sleep. Get some.
I hope you also have a lovely sleep, Sarah.
Thank you very much. This is, again, global work at its best, everyone. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for organizing and getting everyone together. Amazing work. And I see a lot of thank you notes in the chat box. So have a look at that before I close.
I will. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.